Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today we're going to talk about maps. So I think maps are a really interesting part of the game, and we can use them or not use them in a lot of different ways. And I think sometimes they can be a stopping point for some people. I get a lot of people saying, where do you get maps from? How do you use a map? Like, where do you start? So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. But before I get into that, I just want to talk about why you might use a map and why you might not use a map, and how both ways of playing are actually something that I do and mix together. If you're running something like a 5-room dungeon and you're running it theater of the mind, that is, you're not using miniatures, you've basically got 5 rooms, and there can be whatever in between. If you don't understand the 5-room dungeon or don't know much about it, I have a video about it. You can check it out. But basically, there's 5 kind of set pieces that you go through. Sure, there is choice. You can do them in different order. But basically, you're going to encounter these 5 things. You probably don't really need a map for that. You know the entrance is the first challenge. Then there's a roleplay challenge. Then there's whatever. All the other stuff is really just flavor. You're going through hallways. Does it really matter? Probably not in that type of dungeon. Because in the end, it's a linear structure, which is not necessarily bad, but that's what it is. This is also true if you are just running, like I say, anything that's just straight up linear, like you're doing a wilderness adventure where they're just traveling through the wilderness from one point to another, and you're not worrying about exploring, finding new things, going back to these places. You could still have random encounters. They can still get lost, but all it really is dice on the table, figuring out probabilities, that kind of stuff. I have an adventure I made a while back where they're seeking a werewolf. It's kind of like that. Like, I made an adventure, but a map rather, for the style of it, but you didn't really need a map. It's basically you're tracking this werewolf. It's dice rolling. Map's not needed. And obviously, if you're just running a general theater of the mind, the players might not need a map. If I look in most of the games I run, I have a map in front of me if I'm doing a dungeon, but the players don't necessarily map unless they plan on coming back to the place or it's a very large dungeon. They're just kind of making quick notes to themselves, not doing full maps. Now, when do we want to have a full map that we can refer back to, that maybe even the players create a copy of and stuff like that? Now you're talking about things you're returning to, okay? You're talking about mega dungeons where people are going in and out. Changes are happening. They're exploring new areas. This is something you want to map. The players should be making their own map. You definitely need a map. Wilderness terrain where you are hex crawling. And the difference between hex crawling versus a wilderness adventure is that in hex crawling, the way I'm going to describe it is you are exploring. You're moving from one hex to another hex. You're seeing what's in those hexes. You're making notes. It's growing. You're going to come back to it. You're creating a map. That's really what hex crawling is about. It's about creating a map of the wilderness. Now, if you are somebody who uses miniatures, obviously maps are good for the battles, at the very least, even on VTTs, right? If you're this type of GM that runs a lot of theater of the mind, but then you do a big set-piece battle, you're going to want a map for that, right? You want to show the different terrain. You want to show where people can hide, things in the room. All that stuff might be super useful to you. So you might just draw a map during combats. So, maps are those kind of things. You've got battle maps, you've got wilderness maps, you've got dungeon maps, but let's say you don't know where to start. Where do we start to find maps? I'm going to talk about a few resources here, and these are things that I refer to a bunch, although most of the times these days I just draw my own maps, and we're going to talk about that after. Okay, so first we're looking here at Don John. I've probably mentioned this site at least 5 million sites. It's an amazing, amazing resource, and I'm on my iPad, so it looks slightly different than you might see it on a computer screen, but basically we can see here that you've got all these different generators. And if we scroll down, let's just go AD&D. Well, actually, you can do 5th edition. I believe there's also a 5th edition one in here. There's 4E, there's 5th edition, there's weird fiction, science fiction. But let's just go with AD&D because that's closest to what I'm typically running. Okay, so AD&D. We have random generators, which can create all kinds of different stuff. But what we're interested in is maps. So random dungeon generator. Okay, this is going to give us a bunch of options. I'm not going to teach you how to use Don John, just play around with it, but you've got dungeon sizes, the layout, the, whether or not you can come in and out from the outsides, how the room layout is, and then you just go, you hit all that, and you go, boom, construct dungeon. And now we have a dungeon. Now, what's great about this is that you can see all the rooms are numbered, and basically you've got it's stocked, right? You set the level of it, everything else. So that's a pre-made adventure if you want to work with it. But what I usually use these for is just the maps. Okay, so I've got this new dungeon here. Again, all these rooms are filled out if I want them. I can go all the way to the bottom here and go download, and it's going to allow me to download the map, the player's map, which doesn't have the secret doors, and other things, right? So basically, you can use this to create maps to give to the players if you want to make like a treasure map, or just put it on the table so they can see it. You can use it with the secret rooms and everything else for you. You can also download it as a HTML page, self-contained. So if you want to run it from, let's say, my iPad, and I could just touch the map and go around and go from room to room. It's super convenient. Check out Donjon. It's awesome. Now, if you want something that's a little bit more fancy, because Donjon's pretty basic as far as the look of the maps, probably one of the most well-known map makers. They're a great map maker is Dyson Logos. If you go over to their blog, all right, we jump over to Dyson's blog here and we can see there's tons of maps here, right? Here's a map right here, Stony Shore. If you're using it for your own private table and you're not putting it out anywhere, it should be fine just to use it. Any map reel you find like that, you should be able to just use. Just don't use it commercially unless it's licensed. And there are some maps on here that are licensed commercially. What I actually find to be an incredible useful thing to do, obviously you can search around, is I just simply go into Google and I just type in Dyson Logos. And then you can type in, let's say there's a bunch of stuff comes out obviously, but let's say I want a tower. And there we go. I've got a bunch of maps here that are all just images from various things. I've got links. There's actually a link here with these are all different towers. So they've been around for a long time. They've made a lot of maps. They're really, really good maps. In fact, the other day, and we'll talk about this in a second, in my solo game, I was using a map from a project and it was a Dyson Logos map. So this is a great resource. If you don't want to draw maps or don't know how to draw maps or want to be inspired to draw great maps, check out this blog for sure. So another great way to find maps, and this is actually a very old school way, if you will. When I talk to people who were around in like the 70s and 80s that they played, they often did it this way, which is you take a map from an adventure. You have an adventure, maybe you run it, maybe you don't, but it's got a map. You can use it, make some slight modifications, change the cardinal direction. There's an article with Frank Menster. He talks about he has this one map that he's used like hundreds of times, and he says people never know it's the same map because you just change it slightly, change the orientation, you come in from a different place. So you know, players don't, unless they're just sitting there, unless they're a mapper, I guess, they're not going to remember that it's the same map. You only need a handful of maps and just keep bouncing them around. But let's look, for instance, I have in my books here, this great zine, Echoes from Fomalhaut. This is issue number 1, which I've had for a while. You can get this on DriveThruRPG, or you can get it directly from them, in which case they send you a beautiful printed, I mean, this is a great product, I should say. But here we go. There's a map of the Singing Caverns. I can use this adventure, obviously, or I can just use the map. You know, there's level 2 somewhere over here. There's level 2. I've got maps. So maps are easy to come by that way. Now, another thing you could do is just make your own map. And if you want guidance, there's a tool here in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. This is a scan of the book. You can get this on DriveThruRPG, or better yet, go on eBay and get an actual physical copy because it's to hold in your hand. But basically, this was designed for solo play, but you have a dungeon entrance, and then you can roll up all the different rooms as you proceed through. You can even stock the dungeon that way if you don't know what you want put in there. There's also a tool like this in the 5th edition Player's Handbook. So if you have that, similar. I don't know about 2nd, 3rd, or 4th because I don't have those games. So beyond that, and I don't think this one's in 5th, there's also a hex crawl. This is super useful. So this is good. I actually made a video where I use this to create a hex crawl. And what you do here is you start off someplace, let's say the plane, and then you roll a d20, and based on what you roll, the next hex that you go into is that environment. It helps keep things a little bit more consistent. You know, I don't want to say realistic because I don't know. There's plenty of videos out there that'll tell you how to draw a realistic map, but do we need realistic maps? I like to draw my own maps. And the way I draw my maps is I basically just doodle. I think about how I want things to be and I draw them. I run a fantasy world. I don't care if the rivers are running the right way. In fact, if they're not running the right way and a player that happens to have real world knowledge and brings that up, which that's kind of metagaming, but yes, you're right. They are running the wrong way. You know, again, we can use whatever we like, but you know, obviously it's nice to use some common sense. Water should run downhill, et cetera, to the oceans. It's not that hard to make a map for the wilderness. For a dungeon, all you got to really do is think about how things would interconnect. What I generally do, like for my Dungeon 23, and you can see my Dungeon 23, I'll put a link to my blog. Basically, what I do is at the end of the week, I have all, if you don't know what Dungeon 23 is, I'll quickly talk about it. Basically, you are creating a dungeon over the course of a year, creating one room a day. And what I do is I create a week's worth of rooms. I roll them up randomly. And at the end of the week, I sit down and I draw the rooms on my hex paper and then, or graph paper rather, and then I just connect them with corridors. And I recommend that's how you do it. If you know you want to create a dungeon with 10 rooms and you have the contents of those rooms or whatever, place them as you think logically works, and then connect them with 1, 2, 3 different connections between each room so you can create looping paths and just create a space. It doesn't have to make sense, especially if it's a true dungeon, like an underworld dungeon, right? If you're talking about, oh, it was once a temple, go online, look for pictures of temples and draw it. I mean, it's not that hard. Most buildings are just big empty spaces with a couple of rooms attached to them. It's not really that hard. I mean, yes, this is not any negative slight towards an architect. Obviously, it's a great thing to be able to design buildings. I am no architect, but if you want to draw a church, you want to draw a temple, you want to draw a house, it's really not that hard to do. It doesn't have to make 100% perfect sense. Just make it work. And also consider that it should work for what you want to use it for. That is to say, you could never have a D&D battle in my house. There's not enough room here. And you might say, well, that's a good challenge, but not really. You want to give people space. A lot of times people will look at these dungeon generators and be like, wow, that's so stupid. Why are all these rooms 50 feet wide? Well, because, you got a group of 6 or 8 player characters fighting 20 goblins. You got to have space. So that's why, right? Plus, it's more epic. Now, a couple more resources I'm going to talk about. If you want to kind of create your own maps, but kind of not, this right here is really good. I use this for my solo play. This is the Deck of Many Dungeons. I'll put a link. And basically what you do with this is you got your deck, you kind of flip a card out, and it gives you room. And then you just pull the next card, and it gives you that. So effectively, you can connect these together at a table in front of you, and then draw the map on your graph paper. You don't have to use the contents. You don't have to use anything. Obviously, you can use it for solo play like I've been doing. Another cool thing, too, and again, this comes from taking them from adventures, is I have these decks. Decks are so great. I'll put links to all this stuff. This deck right here is a bunch of little adventures, right? So this is side quest decks. And as I was saying, I was using this the other day, and one of the maps in here is actually a Dyson map. And I immediately recognized that it was. Now I won't be able to find it, but basically each one has a little quest if you want to use it, which is also nice. But on the back, a map. I'll just lay these down on the table in front of me, pick a map that works, and go for it, right? You don't need to use what's in the adventure to do it. The maps are something you can keep completely separate. One of the very first times I ever did anything with like adventuring, it was a game that was called, oh no, someone's going to tell me what it's called, something Cave Adventure or Adventure Cave. You know what I'm talking about if you've been around. It was this text-only game, and I learned as an adult that it was actually based on a real cave system. They took the maps and they drew it out, and then they made this little text-only game with it. So you can take maps from real life as well. They're just abundant. No map should ever stop you, I guess is what I'm saying. With random generators and with maps available, you should be able to create an adventure very simply. Maps, are they important? Sometimes. Do I use them all the time? No. I often do multiple sessions in a row where no map is being used, except maybe a large-scale world map, right? Things are moving around. When I go into a town, do I need the town fully mapped out? No, I usually do, I guess for lack of a better word, a point crawl, right? I know where things are. That's in this district. That's in that district. You just go from one place to another. It takes a couple of hours or 10 minutes or whatever. You have your little notes as to the point crawl. Make your maps elaborate and detailed when they need to be, and loose or no map at all when they don't need to be, and that will make your life so much easier. But I would love to know how you use maps. This is a super interesting part of the game, I think. We start playing, and there's obviously maps given to us, right? The first thing you run usually is an adventure module, and there's a map. So then you want to make another adventure, and you have an idea because you saw a TV show, and then you're just like, what do we do? The map is sometimes what's holding people back. So don't let it hold you back. Check out these resources. I will put them in the description below. Let me know in the comments what kind of resources you use for mapping. Share it with the community. Oh, and speaking of community, check the description. You'll find a link to my Discord. Sign up over there and join the conversation. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to join up over there. That's awesome. I will talk to you soon.